Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to continue with post-structuralism and deconstruction. We are going to look especially on one of Dylan Thomas' poetry, A Refusal to Mourn the Death by Fire of a Child in London, and apply deconstructionist methodology to it. So before we begin, a brief recap. We saw some theoretical differences between structuralism and post-structuralism, especially trying to figure out whether post-structuralism was a continuation or a rebellion of structuralism, and how we are thrust into a decentered universe, and this decentrism causing a certain anxiety about language, and how this lack of control is inadvertently revealed by us often enough in everyday conversation and interaction. And then we saw these differences in terms of the origin, where they originated is in terms of linguistic and philosophy and to some tone and style and attitude to language and its aims, their projected aims. We saw Roland Barthes and his movement from structuralism to post-structuralism, referencing his works on structural analysis of narrative and the pleasure of the text, and also the pivotal work which determined his movement away from structuralism, The Death of the Author. Now, this death of the author, this book especially created a certain textual permissiveness which is curbed by Barbara Johnson. In fact, not literally curbed, but then she shows that or dispels the various misunderstanding brought about by this term, death of the author. She shows that deconstruction is not a hedonistic abandonment after all, and with Jacques Derrida, Derrida's work on structure, sign, and play in the discourse of human sciences, we realize that there has been a movement away from the past ways of thinking, and he supplements his theory with the help of Nietzsche and Heidegger and Freud. Then, with the decentering of our intellectual universe, we find that the centers and margins have collapsed, and the reasons behind the collapse we find are the First World War, the Holocaust, the various theories, the scientific discoveries and inventions and improvements, and certain intellectual and artistic revolutions. We also see, with the liberation of the text, we are given a new understanding of the text. And this unnameable situation we find ourselves in, Nietzsche tells us not to be afraid of and be okay, be comfortable with not having any facts to rely on, but merely interpretations. So, with Derrida's deconstructive reading, we come to understand that he wrote plenty of books, but all of which were mostly philosophical in nature, which in turn is applied to linguistics. And we come across this one particular, at least Peter Barry tells us of this one particular sentence that has been variously misconstrued by various critics and asks us to go to the source. So his understanding is that Rousseau's essay on the origin of language is being interpreted by Derrida, and in the process of interpretation, or in the process of interpreting the text, he questions the method he himself is applying and the nature of all interpretations, and finds that language seems to supplement or replace reality. And this replacement, this standing in the place of reality, is once again the nature of the standing in is being determined, where we find that we are inheriting language as a ready-made system which is already built in. So we realize that we are not merely expressing ourselves in words, but merely some aspect of language. And we see that we are incapable of dominating the discourse absolutely. So we come to this idea of doubling commentary, where we believe by interpreting a text we are merely reproducing the text, as to imagining or rather reconstructing the idea of what the writer must have thought or what the writer intended to express in the text. which is inadequate. According to Derrida, it is an inadequate notion of interpretation. So he does not want us or expects or tells us to reconstruct a pre-existing non-textual reality, but to make a critical reading and produce the text, since there is nothing behind it for us to reconstruct, right? Because language is unreliable. You don't know what is there behind the text. That's why he says there is nothing outside the text. Now, we looked into the three concepts, the three philosophies, Derridian philosophies. There are furthermore, but we focused upon these three mainly for our convenience. We saw deconstruction, aporia, logocentrism. Deconstruction, as in how, at least Derrida felt that that the entire all the concepts, the way we looked at the world needed to undergo a deconstruction. How the privileging of one over another needed to be deconstructed. How certain myths that have been formed around each binary had to be deconstructed. And then that deconstruction led to a sense of confusion, which he felt is actually a good thing, is a mark of maturity, because when you are in a state of aporia, it shows that you cannot take sides, you cannot privilege one over another. What you feel is that there are things to be said about on both counts. And then we saw a little bit about logocentrism, which meant reliance or our dependence on reason and logic, and the word itself, and how this reason is grossly, this dependence is grossly misplaced. And then we saw some practical differences between structuralism and post-structuralism concerning the how it is an attitude of mind, what the task of the structuralist and mainly post-structuralist critic is, that is deconstructing text and and understanding deconstruction as merely applied post-structuralism. And yeah, then we saw some three definitions of post-structuralism by J. Cudden, Jacques Derrida, and Barbara Johnson. Then we look into some deconstruction practices and how they aim to harass the text. There is a textual harassment and oppositional reading necessary for deconstruction, and with the aim to unmask internal contradictions and inconsistencies, and the process which deals or which fixes upon one detail of the text and uses that detail as a key to unlock the whole text, and how through that particular part or through that particular detail alone the whole text seems to um, fall around or deconstruct itself. So we have a table here that tells you what the structuralists and the post-structuralists do. The structuralists find parallels and echoes, while the post-structuralists look for contradictions and paradoxes. While the structuralist tries to find balances, tries to balance one part with another, one character with another, one idea with another within a text, the post-structuralist looks for shifts or breaks in tone, viewpoint, tense, time, person, attitude, grammar, everything and anything. And looking for the structuralist looks for reflections and repetitions, whereas the post-structuralist looks for conflicts. While the structuralist looks for symmetry, whether the text is symmetrical, the post-structuralist looks for absences and omissions. Please bear this in mind. By not saying something, the text leaves itself vulnerable, makes itself vulnerable. Okay, so the loopholes in the text, a deconstructionist or the post-structuralist would look for omissions, especially absences of a certain detail or absence of an explanation, things that do not tell. Okay, so it's a very interesting concept you need to explore. Then a contrast. Structuralist looks for the contrasts in text, whereas the post-structuralist look for linguistic quirks. So instead of contrasts are like balanced out. Yeah, dark, light. Oh, they are balanced out. Linguistic quirks would imply that they are, you know, are unexpected. You find them unexpectedly in the most unexpected of places. Okay, unexpected things in the most unexpected of places. You're surprised by their presence, right? Right. In a very, say for instance, it's a very serious text upon a very serious subject, on a very grave subject, and within which you find one fun word. Well, that is linguistic. That could be construed as a linguistic work because it is so out of place and it is so uncommon to find something, a word like that, in the middle of a certain subject, in the middle of discussion of a certain subject. So you see, you need to look for these linguistic quirks as well. While the structures look for patterns, you know, while they try to tell you exactly what is what, okay, as in a certain thing is a certain topic or a tone could be found patterned again and again, right? Or could be found elsewhere as well in a different form, but still you can make out those patterns. But the post-structuralist looks for confusions, or impasse, as you call it, right? Impasse as in a state of being where you're not certain of anything. So basically, the effect is to show textual unity and coherence, and the post-structuralist effect is to show textual disunity. So on the surface, there is disunity, and the structuralist likes would strive to bring in a certain unity and coherence, whereas a post-structuralist who looks at a very unified text, okay, tries to dismantle it and show the underlying disunity in it. So we saw what the post-structuralists do. They read the text against itself, and they look for the textual subconscious, where the meanings are expressed or contrary to the surface meaning. So the surface meaning would say something, and the underlying meaning, the textual subconscious, would imply something very contrary. They will fix upon the surface features of words, similarities in sounds and root meanings of words, a dead or dying metaphor, and bring to the foreground so that they become crucial to the overall meaning. So they look for some metaphor, pun, illusion, all of these. And they also, as I discussed earlier, show disunity, and they also try to fix on single passages or sometimes a single page to show that it is impossible to sustain a univocal reading and end up giving you multiples of meaning, multiplicities of meaning. Yeah, and finally, they look for shifts and breaks. In fact, this is one of the most common, popular things that the deconstructionists look for. Well, coming to today's example, we are going to look at a deconstruction using an example of Dylan Thomas' work or Dylan Thomas' poetry on a refusal to mourn the death by fire of a child in London. It's a poem written by Dylan Thomas, and see, it's we are going to use look at it from three different stages. Okay, the first would be verbal, the second would be textual, and the third would be linguistic. Um, this is kind of really small font. I could not help it. So I hope it is visible to you. So before we proceed, I would like to go through that form once for you so that you have an understanding of what we are going to look forward to. A refusal to mourn the death by fire of a child in London. Never until the mankind making, bird, beast, and flower, fathering and all humbling darkness, tells with silence the last light breaking, and the still hour is come of the sea tumbling in harness. And I must enter again the round Zion of the water bead, and the synagogue of the ear of corn. Shall I let pray the shadow of a sound, or sow my soul's seed in the least valley of sackcloth of the child's death? The majesty and burning of the child's death, I shall not murder the mankind of her going with a grave truth, nor blaspheme down the stations of the breath with any further elegy of innocence and youth. Deep with the first dead lies London's daughter, robed in the long friends, the grains beyond age, the dark veins of her mother, secret by the unmoaning water of the riding Thames. After the first death, there is no other. It's a very beautiful poem, very moving poetry, and it would, I'm not ashamed to say, it took me quite a few readings to get into, get some semblance of meaning behind it. I expect you all to read it at least 3 times and try to decipher what it has to say, every single sentence, what it has to say. Okay? So be very patient and understanding with this poem. So first of all, we are going to look at from a verbal perspective. So what you find, it is very close to the conventional forms or the traditional forms of close reading. Close reading as in what the new critics used to do. They used to look into works very closely, as in William Empson, I. Richards. They asked you to read the text very closely, right? Intrinsic reading, to forget what its historical implications. So at the verbal level, it is very much like that kind of close reading. You look only into the text, inside the text. You don't look at it overall, okay? And this close reading will help you look for paradoxes and contradictions at the verbal level. Okay, you need to look for paradoxes and contradictions, how one word at one point seems to contradict another word that has already appeared, that has already claimed something. So when you are looking for internal contradictions are found to prove the inevitable unreliability and slipperiness of language. So these contradictions inside the text itself, they show the unreliability of the text, how the text is absolutely unreliable. Now, for instance, look at this final line. After the first death, there is no other. I believe you've gotten at least some understanding of what the poem was about. It's supposed to be an elegy, a kind of elegy that mourns the death of a child. Okay, death of a child who died by fire. Okay, and it is also a refusal. He refuses to mourn. Generally, when an elegy is concerned, any panegyric for that matter, it intends to mourn. But the intention here is to refuse mourning. But still, we find an elegy here, which in itself is a contradiction. But then that would be a contradiction at the textual level. Now, we are going to look only mainly first at the verbal level. So when you look at the this last line, after the first death, there is no other. When the word first is used, don't you think a sequence is implied? As in, a first would come only when there is a second or a third, or else it'll be the only death. After the only death, there is no other. So since the word here first, this word is used here, he is inadvertently telling you that there are going to be further deaths, right? At the same time, he is also saying that there is no other death beyond this. There is, you find a paradox, a contradiction at the very least level, the lowest level, that's the verbal level here. So, see, in Peter Barry in his book says, this statement contradicts and refutes itself. If something is called the first, then a sequence is implied of second, third, fourth, and so on. So the phrase, the first death, clearly implies at the literal level that there will be others. Okay? Internal contradictions of this kind are indicative for the deconstructionist of language endemic unreliability. So we are given a hint of the unreliability of language. We're shown how unreliable language is. Now, the post-structuralists tend to reverse the polarity of some common binary oppositions as well. See, I have already told you where the idea of deconstruction emerged from. It emerged from a philosophy, as in Derrida's philosophy, where he believed that this privileging of speech over the written form, or speech over writing, is had to be deconstructed, right? So he applied all of those into various binaries. And the post structuralists, following the tradition, tend to reverse the polarity of such binaries. So there, instead of the male, generally the male is supposed to be the stronger one, or it's more privileged, not the stronger, but more privileged than the female one, right? Light is privileged over dark, day is privileged over night. That is how we generally see it. But here you would find in this particular stanza, fathering an all humbling darkness. Now, darkness here seems to be the one that is giving, giving life to everything. Never until the mankind making bird, beast, and flower, fathering an all humbling darkness. So, darkness seems to be the one that is fathering everything. With the darkness, tells with silence the last light breaking. Now, this darkness is the one that fathers the light itself. The light arrives, is born out of darkness, right? So there won't be light if there is no darkness, right? I mean, see, generally what we are made to understand is light is more significant than dark. Day is more significant than is of more significance than the night. But here there is a reversal of binary opposition, right? Now this binary is totally reversed and inverted within itself. We find that darkness, it has the fathering instinct. It is the one that fathers birds, beasts, and flowers. If not for the darkness, the birds would not rest. If not for the darkness, the beast would not go hunt, or the flower would not bloom. At the very, the very moment the darkness dies, the flower blooms, right? So this these polarities, the polarities are reversed, okay. And the second, so what you find is that night is more privileged than day here. Second is more privileged rather than the first. Now, identifying these paradoxes within is the first step in reading against the grain, showing the signifiers at war with the signified and revealing its repressed unconscious. You are shown the unconscious of the text that is repressed, that is hidden away, that is that is that is not overt, that is not visible at first reading. So in this you know in this step, in this system, what you find is uh, it is very much a recognizable version of the world we live in, but reversed. But it is reversed in its own sense, in its own way. Anyway, we will move on next to the textual stage of deconstruction. So we finish with the verbal, now we are going to the textual stage. So this moves beyond phrases to take an overall view of the poem. Okay, so first off, we focused merely on phrases and certain, some 2 or 3 lines at most. But now we are going to look at the overall view of the poem. During the stage, we look for shifts or breaks to reveal instabilities of attitude and lack of fixed and unified position. We are now going to focus on the fault lines. So they may be shifts in focus, time, tone, POV as in point of view, attitude, pace, vocabulary, and even grammar or tense. For instance, look at the focus. In the first few lines, it seems the focus is on the nature itself, how, as if it seems to work in terms of aeons, right? It seems to work in terms of aeons, as in one aeon has passed and the other has begun, right? And the focus then suddenly shifts to the child in question, okay, who's mourning, or the poet is doing now. And then once again you move on to the overall, to the majestic world itself, the nature itself, right? Nature, as in the nature that constitutes constitutes everything humans, water, water bodies, or fire, the natural things, God, heaven, earth, all of these, right? So what you will do is you will look for shifts and breaks to reveal breaks in, focus and time. Now look at the time here. Initially, you seem to be at one point in the world at one aeon, okay, and all of a sudden you find yourself, the you see the poet going to probably heaven, because there is mention of Zion here in synagogue and year of corn. All of these seems to indicate that, you know and sow my soul seed. Sowing would indicate, giving birth to something from the heavens. This is more earthbound, and this is more of a kind of a heavenly abode that the writer, that the poet finds himself after death. It is quite, of course, we need to appreciate its ambiguity for what it is, because we can only guess at the truths behind these lines rather than arrive at a certain truth. So, yeah, we'll so shift in time, you see, the time, the movement of time from one aeon to another, and the tone, how the tone seems to move from being a very neutral, yeah, neutral, it goes to the first person, and I must enter again. And then and there is no first person here at all. Again, it goes to the third person. Movement from third person to first person to first person to third person. So there is a change in POV as well, as in a point of view. And the attitude seems to be again shifting. It seems to be all calm and composed, and a certain conciliatory, and it's taken a certain conciliatory tone, whereas here there is a kind of rebellion. I mean, I find certain rebellion against, you know against the idea of death itself, and the idea of mourning the death. It's as if like he is refusing to murder the mankind of our going with a grave truth, nor blaspheme down the stations of the breath with any further elegy or innocence and youth. In fact, he realizes that this girl has died prematurely, has met her and prematurely, but he refuses to mourn the lost innocence and lost youth, because that would be a blasphemy. To him, it would be a blasphemy, and he will not murder the mankind. Now, mankind could be looked at from different ways. Well, we'll go to the when we go to the linguistic part, we'll look into it a bit more closely. So they tend to show paradoxes and contradictions at a larger scale. So, see, as Peter Barry says, the first two stanzas imagine the passing of geological eons and the coming of the end of the world. The last light breaks. The sea finally becomes still. The cycle which produces bird, beast, and flower comes to an end as all humbling darkness descends. But the third stanza is centered on the present. See, the first two stanzas seem to be focusing on some geological aeon, whereas the third stanza is the present. It's the actual thing that happened when he wrote it, right? Now, the final stanza takes a broad vista like the first two, but it seems to center on the historical progression of the recorded history of London. When he says, see, deep where the first dead lies London's daughter. First dead would imply somewhere in past someone must have died, and with that first someone, the London's daughter here, the London's daughter could be the child itself, right? The London's daughter lies. So there is a historical continuum, a historical progression going on in here. Historical progression of the recorded history of London as witnessed by the unmourning water. So the one constant in this historical progression is the unmourning water of Thames. Yeah, the Thames is the river in England, and this water, which has seen so many deaths from the beginning of time, is unmourning. It cannot mourn because it understands, unlike the heart that is pleading for the death of the child, that death is inevitable, and there is no point in mourning. At least I I would like to understand this poetry in that sense. So we find that there is no single wider context is provided to frame and contextualize the death of the child in a defined perspective. And the shifts in Thomas' poem make it very difficult to ground his meaning. So you need to look into other examples as well in the textual level for breaks and discontinuities, and especially, where is that? Especially, you need to look for omissions alongside breaks, shifts, and contradictions. We've seen breaks, we've seen shifts and contradictions in at a textual level, but you also need to look for what has not been told. We are not told why why he refuses, why the poet refuses to mourn, and then we are not even told why, after having refused to mourn the death, he still seems to be writing an elegy. He still seems to be mourning, right? It is a kind of mourning, right? It is an elegy. Despite his claim, it is still a panegyric on the death of child. Anyway, we will now move on to the linguistic stage. The linguistic stage, I hope you can see this, looks for moments in the poem when the adequacy of language itself as a medium of communication is called into question. Okay, in this, you are focusing on the language, how the language itself seems to be as a medium inadequate. Okay, inadequate for communication, for giving us any reliable answers. Example, when implicit references are made to the unreliability or untrustworthiness of language. So saying something unsayable, saying that is impossible to utter, saying that language inflates, deflates, or misrepresents its object, but continuing to use the language anyway. All of these show, all of these are deconstructions at a linguistic level. Now, the poem does what it says it won't do. Agreed? The poem tells you that I refuse to mourn the death. But then what is the poem doing? It is, despite saying it, saying or refusing to mourn, it is still mourning. Okay? Again, there is a play on the words mankind, grave, etc. So as I said earlier, deconstructionists look for one particular passage, one particular word, and look for its, especially at a linguistic stage, they look for its etymology, its origin, it is and treat it as a pun or an allusion to something else entirely different, and use it as a key to dismantle the text, right? We've already spoken about it enough times. I believe you shouldn't find it difficult to understand. So look for words. Look for words that work against it. See, sow my salt seed. Look at this phrase, sow my salt seed. Now, sowing implies that you are going to put some seed in some place so that a plant would grow out of it, something could grow out of it. So it should indicate fertility, right? The place should be fertile, or the seed should be good. Now, what he is saying is salt seed. Now, this salt seed, I believe everyone is at least to some extent familiar with this agricultural concept that any seed that has been salted would not grow. It would become sterile, right? So from the sterile place, can something grow? It is a contradiction by itself. There is no point in sowing a seed that is salted. Nothing would grow out of it. In the least valley of sackcloth of the child's death. See, there is a basic contradiction existing at the linguistic level that tells you something else, okay, while intending something else. I should not be using the word telling because we are reconstructing that. No, sorry, we're not reproducing the text, but producing the text. So it is what we say that matters, not what the text says. Anyway, so when you look at this particular word, what's that? Yeah, mankind. Look at the allusion, look at the pun in this word mankind, or grave. Now here the grave would indicate the grave in which the child lies, or the grave is in the seriousness that is very sincere truth. Now this mankind could include the entire mankind as in people in general, or the humanity as in the humanity of people. It would die, or it would hurt, mankind with a truth, with her, or mankind of her going with a grave truth, right? So coming to, yeah, play on the words. There is a play on the words, mankind, grave, etc. The poet professes to stand outside the available range of cliched, elegiac stances or discursive practices, indicating no pure stance possible. So we are showing, I mean, we are shown that the the poet seems to stand outside the available range of cliched. Cliched as in generally what the elegy has to look like, what the elegy constitutes. All of it is not there. I mean, none of it is available there except for maybe one or two lines. And the elegiac stances or discursive practices in all the practices of discussion, or discussion on the death of a person, all of it, it seems they are all, there is no nothing for the poet to stand upon within this range, that there is no pure stance available for him to stand in, right? So he has to go for this ambiguity, and this ambiguity, there is this impurity of language, and he seems to slip on it. There is so much of slipperiness in the medium that he has made use of, that it is very difficult to arrive at one particular understanding of what he wants to say. Well, of course, on the surface, we understand that it means that the nature itself, it's it's harnessed at some point, and this death, or any death for that matter, is not anything to be mourned of, even though you are hurt, you are saddened by the passing of the away of the child. It seems the salty tears, I mean, it could be interpreted in that way as well, you know tears are salty, right? And but then it's like a seed that is salted, a seed that is useless. So the tears that I sow will be useless, so there is no point in mourning. And I shall not murder the mankind of a going. Again, it seems to imply that you cannot there is no point in giving everyone the grave truth of death, as in everyone is familiar with the idea of death, is it's not an abstract concept. Death is not an abstract concept, it's a very real thing. But I will not murder the mankind, because the not thinking of death lets people live or enjoy life. I mean, it could be interpreted in that sense. Again, if you look at the deep with the first dead lies London's daughter, it tells you something. It tells you that there has been so many deaths so far, and this is one of those daughters, London's daughters. But we don't know if London is, if the city itself is embracing enough of all the people who have died there. Robed in long fringed the grains beyond age, the dark veins of a mother, secret by the unmourning water. The dark veins of the mother, the mother earth itself is unfolding the daughter of London, her own daughter, beside the unmourning water. But there, after the first death, there is no other. We do get some understanding of what the text intends to say, but yeah, but we also realize that despite that we also realize that there is no pure stance available. There is no outright an outright stance possible here, outright indication of whether there is a possibility of mourning death, whether you can possibly mourn death, or is it okay to mourn the death of this particular child, or as the religious scriptures tell you, not to mourn the death at all of anyone, because it's a natural process of living, natural conclusion of living, right? So there are so many possibilities that there is a certain impurity of language is inevitable for Thomas, particularly in this poem. Well, when we see his other poems like "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night," I mean, that's one of my favorite poems. When you look at that poem, it is fairly simple and straightforward. But still, if you can try to, deconstruct it, I'd be more than happy to see it. So, despite the first line that runs like a conventional panegyrical oratory, first line of the last stanza, with the dead person transformed to some larger than life heroic figure, what we see, she is turned into a larger than life, sorry, yeah. So, she is made to look as someone else, something beyond an ordinary death. What you see is she is lying with the first dead, as if like she has been elevated in ranks, as if she has been elevated in status, and robed. And when are you robed? As in you are ready for a kind of, a royal procession or something, within the long friends. So this particular idea shows that that the normal, the mortal, the person who is dead is turned into or transformed into a heroic figure. Again, look at the nature of metaphorical family implied by mother and daughter. Yeah, there is a metaphor here. You see that there is where's that? Yeah, the mother and daughter, London's daughter, dark veins of a mother. The metaphor used here for the child and for the you know for the earth that has taken her, or the metaphor of murder or unmourning themes. Look at those metaphors as well. You would find again a certain contradiction, a certain shift in understanding, or multiplicities of meaning existent in each word. So the text reveals itself, finally, the result I have stated here as result of, yeah. Text reveals itself to be fractured, contradictory, and symptomatic of a cultural and linguistic malaise. Aims to show disunity and make all poems look alike as they emerge angst-ridden, fissured enactments of linguistic and other forms of indeterminacy. So what you find is that the text shows itself that it is fractured, where it's completely broken and has full of contradictions, and is a symptomatic of a cultural and linguistic malaise, as in it is an illness, a linguistic illness, a cultural illness. The text shows the symptoms of those illnesses. No matter which text it belongs, or what age it belongs to, what culture it belongs to, or what language it belongs to, the text always shows some illness, some deformity in its cultural or linguistic background. Again, with the deconstructionist attitude, what happens is, aiming to show disunity, they tend to make all poems look alike. So this is not only the concern of the deconstructionists; it applies to all forms of critical study, you could call it, if you can. Say, for instance, if you're going for structuralism or feminist criticism or any other writing for that matter, you see only through the lens of that particular, particular critical method, critical analysis. So what happens is, when you are working with deconstruction, what happens is the text emerges as angst-ridden. Every text, okay, not merely this poetry, whatever poetry you take, every poem emerges as angst-ridden, fissured enactments of linguistic and other forms of indeterminacy. Not merely linguistic, but other forms as well that are indeterminate. Okay, there is no determined reading possible for any text. So what happens is the very individuality of a text is lost. So once you realize that one text is just as same as the other, the enjoyment is stolen away. Anyway, I think I've taken enough time of yours, and I believe I was clear and you could understand something. Thank you for now. Stay safe, be happy. Assalamu alaikum.